Welcome to the People and Planet podcast, a show all about human health, planetary health, and the links between them. I'm your host, Alya an integrative nutrition health coach with a master's in environmental sustainability. I spent most of my life exploring these topics, and this podcast is my effort to collect and deliver information from experts to improve the quality of your life and that of our planet. Thank you so much for being here. Today, I'll be speaking with Cheyenne Carell, who works as a somatic experiencing practitioner and a co-active coach. She has been supporting clients in healing from trauma for over a decade. She began her career working in substance abuse treatment centers as a group facilitator and trauma specialist. She now works one-on-one with clients and develops trauma-informed curriculum for substance abuse treatment centers. Cheyenne's focus is on understanding and resolving the root issue of trauma held in the nervous system that is often a major contributor to addiction and many mental health issues. Although I have never personally experienced Cheyenne's somatic therapy method, I've shared clients with her and have had incredible feedback from them. I look forward to unpacking what this healing modality is all about with her today. I hope you enjoy. Hi Cheyenne, thanks for being here. How are you today?
Hey, I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm great. Thanks so much for being on the show. I've been eager to have you on the show and ask you all kinds of questions about somatic therapy. I haven't had anyone like you on the show yet, so I'm really excited for this conversation.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm really excited too.
So you and I have shared clients before, and I've referred friends to you before. I've never worked directly with you, but I've heard amazing things about your practice and your method and how effective it is in helping people's nervous system regulate and heal emotional wounds and traumas. And you talk about yourself being a somatic therapist or a somatic experiencing practitioner. So I guess that's a good place to start. What does that mean? And what is somatic therapy?
Basically, what somatic work is it's relating to the body. So a lot can fall underneath that category, basically. And it's become, to my knowledge, just based on looking at Instagram, very popular in the last year or so. And I think the reason it's popular is because it really works. And, psychology has gone through many transitions, and overall Western psychology specifically has been really focused on how do we work with the mind in order to manipulate it to resolve issues, right? How do we process thoughts? How do we work with our narrative? How do we work with intrusive thoughts or anxiety or depression and what comes with that? How do we manage that? And, we do that through meds, through talk therapy. And when we are so focused just on the mind and the narrative, we're actually not looking at what's underneath that and what's the root cause to these thoughts. And so specifically in somatic experiencing, I can't speak for all somatic modalities, but specifically in somatic experiencing, what we're looking at is what is the traumatic stress that's stored in the body? What's the nature of it? Is it fight, flight, or freeze? What's the pattern of it? How has it been stored? How does it show up in your day-to-day life? And then we can look at, okay, I'm having these thoughts. I'm having these anxieties. I'm, feeling really uncomfortable in my body day to day, or when I'm in this environment specifically, or this one, right? And instead of saying, okay, how do we get you more comfortable? How do we challenge those thoughts and feelings? We listen to them and we say, okay, what's going on in the nervous system? What's getting triggered? What traumatic stress that's stuck in the nervous system is getting triggered and activated so that you're making up a story about your life now. And sometimes it is what's going on in your life now. Sometimes you need to get out of a, emotionally abusive relationship or physically abusive. Sometimes you need to, change your job because it's not what's right for you. And so, there's ways to figure that out. But oftentimes what's going on when it's really high level anxiety or depression is we're not actually releasing that traumatic stress from prior events. And we're projecting them onto the current day-to-day life, which is actually quite safe. And so somatic therapy, somatic experiencing is really about getting people to feel safer in their bodies so that they can figure out what life actually feels like when we feel safe, and then create a life from that, right? Versus creating it from old patterns and that feeling that they're not safe, that they're not going to, say they didn't have enough. And this is kind of more dramatic because it could be much smaller traumas, but say someone didn't have enough food and had to, when they were a kid, maybe they had a little bit of short food supply and they now feel like they can't stop working, right? They have to keep working. Otherwise, nothing's ever going to be enough because it never was enough then. And that was a chronic traumatic experience to not have enough of a need, right? And so their system, they might hoard money now, right? And we could look at that just from a psychological perspective. But if we look at it as far as like, what's the fear in the nervous system that's coming up and forcing the story to be projected out onto the life that they're living, that's when we can actually work with releasing that traumatic stress that's underneath that. And then going to feel a little safer, going to be able to maybe go on a few more vacations, hoard less money, right? And we're not even really directly working with a narrative or thoughts. And so it's really cool to see. But does that kind of explain a little bit? I know there's a lot there, but...
Yes, and I think a really clear distinction here is the word somatic, for people who don't know, is referring to the physical. It's referring to the body. And as you clearly stated, when we talk about conventional therapy or psychology, it's related to the mind. It's very, I would say, top down. And the work you do is almost like bottom up. It's body up. And so what's the difference between the nervous system regulation or dysregulation, not feeling well in the body, and everything you just explained versus emotions?
So the emotion, that's a great question. The emotions are going to be experienced within different levels and types of activation, right? So for example, when we're getting up into a fight-flight response, and I'm going to just bring out the sheet. So there's a lot on here. I'm going to try to hold it steady. But basically, I'll just explain a little bit about what happens when a traumatic event happens. So basically what happens is we're down here in safety and our systems go up into fight flight. Typically, that's what happens first, unless we're experiencing an inescapable attack, which is when we go to freeze. So fight, flight, and freeze are defenses against death, right? And we may just be kids hearing our parents argue and go into these states, right? It's perceived threat. It's not necessarily always real physical threat to life that happens. So when we go up into fight and flight, there's a lot of different emotions and feeling that comes with that state, okay? And a good way of really identifying if you're in it, and this really can help people in knowing if they're in it and how to help them get out, is noticing what you're feeling. So here there's panic, fear, anxiety, worry, concern, rage, anger, irritation, frustration, right? Those are emotions that we're going to be feeling in that fight flight state. Okay. And once we go up into freeze, we're going to be feeling they're both activation, but they're quite different in the experience of them. So freeze is going to be dissociation, numbness, depression, conservation of energy, helplessness, shame, shutdown, hopelessness, and trapped feelings, right? And so part of healing traumatic stress is we have to go into these feelings a little bit. We kind of go into them, not too much, because the way that we see going into them too much is it can be a vortex that pulls us in and can re-traumatize us. And that's why, therapeutic modalities that really encourage catharsis are becoming quite outdated, because all they do is bring you into it and then you drop out, but then you're actually just more likely to go back in, and they can be re-traumatizing. So we want to work with it little bits at a time. And so what we're working with is some pretty uncomfortable emotions, right? There is a lot of intensity in an experience where we are feeling that we are about to die, right? And what we're doing is we're kind of teasing that apart through tracking sensations in the body and not letting it get too intense, grounding into safety, right? We're titrating. So we move into safety awareness, and then we move into the uncomfortable sensations and emotions that come with those. And then we move back into safety. And what we do when we go back and forth like that is we open up a door for that traumatic stress that's wound up in these emotions and sensations to actually release. Okay. And so when we come out also, so say we live in freeze for a long time, we start to kind of thaw out and come back to life. We go in the same way, or we come out the same way we go in. So we might, as we start to do this work, you might start to feel increased anxiety because you have more life force going on, right? There's less shutdown in the system. And so we're going to really wake up some emotions that are pretty uncomfortable. And that's why the process is so important to do slowly, so that it's not too overwhelming for anyone's system and doesn't, become re-traumatizing, but instead really supports them in getting back to this baseline of feeling safe in the world.
I'd love to ask you about what a typical session looks like and how we do this therapy. But first, I want to just get a definition from you about trauma. I'm really glad that we're talking about traumas. We're not stigmatizing it as much. The taboo is kind of washing away in kind of more mainstream spaces. But at the same time, I think there's a spectrum of emotional wounding and traumas. And now we're using anything that's difficult, a difficult emotion or past memory, and we're titling it with trauma. But not everything that's hard and challenging or a little ugly is a trauma. So I'd love to ask you, as a trauma specialist, what exactly is the definition of trauma? What does the spectrum look like? And what's the difference between a trauma and an emotional wound?
That's a great question. So yes, I agree. Everyone is calling everything traumatic. It's a little over the top, and it's funny. It's, we're integrating, the awareness of trauma kind of on a collective level is what I see happening. And first thing we do is kind of overdo it. So it's a great question. So trauma, I define trauma, and, the somatic experiencing world defines trauma by how it affects someone's nervous system. Okay. So it really doesn't have to do with the event. Actually, you can see two people could go through the same exact event that someone, outside perspective would see as incredibly traumatic, and one can come out traumatized and the other can come out fine. And so really what's happening is it depends on so much. So it even starts in utero, right? Or before, if we're going to get into intergenerational trauma, right? With our nervous system's capacity to have resiliency. Some people come into this world with very little capacity. Some people come into this world with high capacity, depending on their experience in utero, their intergenerational trauma that they're coming in with or lack thereof. And so it's really such an individual thing what constitutes trauma for a person. But basically, once you have a traumatic event, so traumatic event is going to be something that brings your system into fight, flight, or freeze, and your system isn't able to fully discharge. So I'm just going to go through this and give you an example of, I'll talk through it about an animal, okay, because that's an easy example. So say that because animals and humans, we have the same trauma responses. Humans just are really, really struggle to release the trauma, and animals do a beautiful job of that. So say there's a gazelle, right, down here in safety, just eating some grass, and suddenly a lion peeks through the grass, and the gazelle notices, here's the lion stepping towards him. The gazelle innately, the system says, okay, I'm not going to fight this tiger or this lion, right? That's not a good idea. And I'm not going to freeze yet, so I'm going to run, right? That's the best defense. Their instincts tell them. So the gazelle starts running, and the gazelle, right, the heart rate goes up, blood rushes to the extremities. They are in fight or flight, sympathetic arousal. This is a branch of the nervous system. And so the way that I like to describe sympathetic arousal is like if you press the gas in a car all the way down, right? So it's like turning everything up and on, moving really fast. Okay, so the system is going to do that as long as it works. And at some point, innately, this gazelle is going to see this lion chasing it, and it's going to be running out of that sympathetic energy. And at some point, it'll say, freeze is my best response, actually. If I shut down and play dead, that's my last defense against death. It might leave me alone if I play dead, right? It's not having these thoughts consciously. It's all instinctual. And so what happens here at the freeze is it's like pressing the brakes all the way down. Okay, and if you imagine brakes and gas pressed all the way down in a car, there's a lot of trapped energy in the nervous system, right, that gets stuck. And so even though up here freeze, and in humans, it's going to look like depression, right? It's going to look like overwhelmed, shut down, right? Depression is kind of more an extreme version, but you're going to feel a lot of, difficulty doing basic tasks, feeling pretty overwhelmed day to day and helpless, right? When we're stuck in that freeze. And so the gazelle goes into that state, everything shuts down. And even though it looks like nothing's happening, there's actually a lot going on in this underneath the surface. There's a lot of trapped energy that's actually keeping that life force from moving. Right? And so the gazelle has to say the lion gets distracted, the gazelle survives. It's laying on the ground and it goes through this process. It goes through these feelings and emotions also, right? Shame, shutdown, hopelessness, preparation for death, trapped feeling, right? And then it starts to come back into life. And what's happening for the gazelle that's beautiful is it's first off supported by the natural world, right? There is rhythms and support within nature that really allow deactivation to happen in a way that is quite supportive.
Such as?
Basically, what nature provides is an environment of regulation, right? Nature is constantly self-regulating. And so if we go outside and spend a little time in a forest, most people will come back and say they feel a certain sense of renewal. They feel more regulated in themselves. And it's because we're actually meant to live in that environment as animals, right? It's a self-regulating environment and it supports us in our own self-regulation. Whereas, say we're in New York City walking down the street, there's not much regulation going on there. We have to really fight for our self-regulation in a big city, or even just in a small room that's not connected to the rhythms of nature, right? So, if you think about the gazelle laying between some trees or out in a field, slowly coming back into life, right? There's a lot more support there than, say, if one of us got in a fender bender and we jump out of the car and go talk to the cop and, figure out what's going on, and then we decide to lay down in the middle of the street, right? Like, that's not gonna help. So you could kind of just see intuitively how that would be an additional support for that coming back to life. When that gazelle comes back down and it is able to release that traumatic stress that's stuck at the system from that fight, flight, freeze state, what happens is it goes through this process of shaking and then 3 deep breaths. And then it might start running, right? Because the way it goes in is how it comes out. So if it was running right when it went into freeze, it's going to wake up and it'll start running a little bit, right? And that fight, flight feelings are going to come back. And so that's good to note, just as we go through this process, people who are working on their trauma, that those intense emotions and sensations come back for a moment as our life force comes back into our nervous systems.
So what exactly is a trauma, if we were to define it again on that spectrum? You're saying it's different for every person. Is it when the gas and the brake are on at the same time?
It's either. So the gas and the brake on at the same time is going to be that freeze response, and that's going to be a trauma. But also, if we just have the fight flight on, and we aren't able to come back down into safety and really release that stress, that's also trauma. Okay, so that could be an event. This kind of actually validates people saying everything is trauma in a way, because it really depends on them. And if we have low resiliency in our nervous system from experiencing a lot of trauma, we could walk out and a bus could go by and it could feel like a trauma for our nervous system. Often I would say those things are more so triggering trauma than trauma themselves. But it really depends on how your nervous system responds to an event. And that's what really defines it as trauma.
Okay, because a lot of us living in this very fast-paced world are experiencing fight, flight, or freeze almost daily. And so I guess what you're saying is one thing is to feel it, but then to close that stress response, the loop, and come back into safety. And for traumatizing events, it's like we're never really coming back into feeling safe in our bodies, correct?
Correct.
What does a session look like? So you talked about you come out of it the way you came in. You talked about animals shaking. I think somatic therapy has a lot of discharge through physical practices, whether it's shaking or dancing or all kinds of breath work. But just want to ask you, like, what does a typical session look like? How do we release trapped trauma in the body? And let's talk about trauma from like 15 years ago or childhood. And you're a 50-year-old woman. And so that's 40 years of like something being trapped in the body. It's not something that happened a week ago. How do we even begin to like address something like this in a session?
Yeah. So what's really amazing is that the body remembers everything. And so we don't have to dig. We actually don't want to dig at all, because digging is, kind of keeping the natural process from happening. And, what a session looks like is it might not look very interesting from the outside, but there's a whole lot going on the inside. And the client can attest to that. So basically what I'm providing, in a sense, is what nature is providing, but I'm providing it at more of a skilled level, right? So I'm watching my client's nervous system. I'm noticing when they start to get activated, if they start to dissociate and to freeze a bit, if they're feeling safe and regulated. And what I'm doing is I'm supporting them in moving, just dipping their toes into that trauma, those trauma feelings, and then coming back into safety. This is kind of the most simplistic way to explain it. And we're doing so through tracking sensation. And so what will start to happen as we do this process is the body will start to have memories show up. So, for example, I'll talk about one of my first trainings, one of my practice sessions was on a woman who had been in a car wreck a few years back. Okay, and so we began tracking sensation, and she just notices that her hand wants to go like this.
Like closed
like this.
For people who can't see.
Closed fist. Yep. And I'm asking her what wants to happen with that, right? So we're just really going into noticing the sensation and how it wants to move. And so she starts to turn it to the right, turn her fist to the right slightly. And then suddenly a memory shows up of her right as she turned her car on, getting hit by another car on the side. Right? And so the intensity, both emotion and sensation, begin to show up in the body at that point. That's really tied up in that moment, which happened in several seconds. Right? And so what we're doing is we're creating space and safety to unpack that sensation and that intensity that is traumatic stress, right? That turned on in that moment. And so we move very slowly through the experience that she's having, right? She sees her drink fly up in the air and go everywhere, right? We're really moving slow with it. And as we walk through that, we're able to actually release that traumatic stress. as we give it space and safety to exist in, right? Because she had no time to process that. She had to get, put in an ambulance. She was not conscious, right? There's so much intensity there. And so, we took the time to really go through all of the sensations and emotions that were happening at a pace that allowed them to really digest. That's kind of a great way that I like to explain it, is it's like digesting. It's like when we have a traumatic event, we like eat more than our stomach can handle in a moment, right? And it never really digests. And when we go back and do this work, we just take one small bite at a time and allow it to really digest and integrate so that we can come back to our normal functioning again.
I love that example, and I love that you gave a real world example so people can conceptualize and visualize what actually is happening with somatic therapy, that you're going through the memories slowly and you're offering safe space for the stuff that is frozen in the body in some way. Maybe frozen is not a good word, but it's kind of stuck, to come up and out and process everything. You once said to me that there is also a very clear distinction between trauma and grief. I would love to unpack that with you.
Yeah. So, I work with all sorts of different clients, and some come in grieving. A lot of them come in grieving something, someone. And the way that I work, often when you're working with trauma, grief will show up, right? So we may unpack a trauma and suddenly there's a lot of grief, right? Because there was a traumatic event tied up with a loss. And so you never really got to fully grieve. And so it's kind of like opening it up and then the grief is there. The way that I work with grief is different than the way that I work with trauma. The way I work with trauma is through titration. So that's really leaning into the trauma a little bit, leaning out of it, leaning into it a little bit, leaning out, right? To allow that digestion to happen, we need to move into safety for there to actually be the capacity to release it. With grief is kind of its own process, right? And what grief really needs is just consistent support, because it goes in and out on its own, right? Someone will kind of go into shutdown or bargaining, right? In their own process. It has its own life in a way that needs to be lived out in order for the grief to feel like it's dissipated, right? And so the way I work with grief is really just support and listening and holding space and allowing the body to have a safe space for that process to happen. Because when the body isn't safe, and this is why when you resolve trauma, grief shows up, you can't grieve. If you are in survival mode, up in fight, flight, or freeze, you've got to hold it together. Your body says, we don't have time for that, right? It doesn't even have time to pee, right? It's going to not notice its functions and its needs when it's stuck in a survival response. And so as people come out of the survival responses through the somatic experiencing, they will start to feel more grief. And usually there's a period of that, depending on what they've experienced in life and what they've lost. And then following that, there's renewed sense of, feeling good in their body again. It's really the life coming back to them.
Do you find in your work and with your clients that they sometimes gaslight themselves? Because in my line of work, I see that a little bit, especially with women of reproductive age and women who have really imbalanced hormones, and they're going through really intense PMS symptoms or PMDD, which is an intense experience of PMS, and they start to gaslight themselves. Oh, it's just, my hormone. Oh, it's just how I feel. Right. It's just something I'm going through. Oh, it's just this. It's just that. It's just my cycle. And I try to explain to them that something is showing up for you. Yes, you might be more sensitive to it, but something is showing up. Don't gaslight yourself. Don't just throw it away and discard it. It might be a little bit more heightened during certain times of your cycle, but there's something real coming here. And it could be physical health that we need to address with hormone imbalance. It can be that sometimes, but there's something very real showing up here. So this is my experience of it because I'm a health coach. So I have different experiences in my practice, but I was wondering, you deal with a lot of really big emotions and big events. Do you find that people are gaslighting themselves when they're dealing with their own traumas, or they diminish them, or they make them smaller, or their grief?
Definitely. Everyone has different patterns. I really view imbalance as far as the way we relate to what we're experiencing on a spectrum. And so one side of the spectrum is going to be disconnecting from it, right? And belittling it, making it nothing, shutting down from what we're experiencing, pushing it away. And the other is going to be relating to it too much and building our identity around it and kind of drowning in it, right? And so I see people on both sides of the spectrum in the way that they're navigating living with the symptoms of trauma. And both, in a way, you could say, are gaslighting themselves because they're both not connected to their ability to actually feel resiliency and feel their own agency enough to integrate and face what they're experiencing, right? Both are reacting out of a place of feeling powerless and avoidant of really being with their experience that's uncomfortable. And that is a major, a big part of what I'm doing with this work, and really the core principle is that this work is about listening to the body. And we've learned for a long time to listen to the mind, right? That top-down approach, and to control the body. But what happens is when we have trauma, we get wounded instincts. And you can't control wounded instincts. You need to heal them. And so we, people in this, that show up as clients often have kind of drank that Kool-Aid, right? Of like, I just have to control it. Okay, I just have to push it down. I have to get rid of it. I have to focus on the next thing. I have to manage. And if I can manage, that means I'm strong. Versus if I actually go into the process of healing, which takes a huge level of surrender, right? Sometimes it's easier to gaslight ourselves. It is easier to gaslight ourselves than it is to surrender to a process of healing that's really scary. Okay, to saying, I don't know what's going on, and I'm really scared of these symptoms before my period, but I'm just going to push them away because it's just what happens for me. Versus I'm going to really look into what's underneath that and allow myself to really open up to what that might be in an embodied way, right? That's really scary. And that's why we have to do it carefully. But we're also quite brainwashed that that's just not how we do it, right? We're gaslit, and then we gaslight ourselves into thinking that we just need to manage instead of really tune in and listen to and attune to our bodies. And so the mind is really meant to serve the body, to listen to it, to tend to it, versus to control it, right? And you can see that. I like to back out on a collective scale. You can see that without getting off topic on so many levels as a, disordered thinking on a collective level, at least here in the US. When it comes to mental health, when it comes to many things, is the idea of we need to control versus attune to. And that's what healing really is about.
I've never heard this phrase, wounded instincts, before. I find that so interesting. Could you unpack that a little bit further for us, please?
Yeah. So when I say wounded instincts, what I mean is trauma. And so when the system doesn't, when I say system, I mean nervous system, when the nervous system isn't able to regulate and feel safe in the world, it's wounded. I like to think of traumatized bodies as bodies that have wounded instinct, okay? Because what's going on with a traumatized body is it's not actually connected to its ability to self-protect and feel safe in the world through its ability to self-protect and co-regulate. And when a body doesn't feel safe, it's going to make up a lot of stories when it's in a safe environment about how the environment isn't actually safe, right? Because I like to think of our bodies kind of like little time machines. So say when we are a kid, you know, dad has a temper, he slams a door during a fight with mom or something, right? Our systems are traumatized from that experience, from whatever happened there, and the slamming of the door is associated with it. And so maybe we're just, you know, walking around in our day-to-day life and we hear someone slam a door. Suddenly we're back in that fight or flight response, right? Suddenly we think, dad's angry, he's scared, or I'm scared, dad's angry, my life is threatened in this moment. Okay? And we don't have those thoughts consciously, but physiologically our bodies go there. And then we look around and we make up a story about why we're so unsafe, right? Maybe we think, what's the crime level in this neighborhood? Or, you know, we start to go into some sort of story about why we're not safe when we really are. Okay? And that's a wounded instinct. You can really see it well in pets as well.
So it's kind of like the baseline is a little imbalanced, because if we think about, well, when I think about instinct, it's kind of like our baseline way of functioning. When it comes to instinct, it's like it's unconscious and subconscious way of functioning and behaving. And then now, and when you say wounded instinct, it's like those behaviors that are so deeply ingrained in us are a little bit off balance because we're not embodied or feeling like we're in a safe body. And you did use the word embodied recently, and I wanted to ask you about that. What do you mean when you say we're embodied or some people are not feeling embodied? What does that mean exactly?
Yeah, so I think that's up for interpretation for each individual to a certain degree of what that means for them. But when we're in fight or flight, we typically aren't really in a state of feeling our bodies fully, right? People report experiencing feeling maybe like a little outside of themselves. Like if you just kind of tune into what you're feeling when you're in that really activated state, you might feel like you're outside a little bit. You might have no sense of where you are because it's just this activated state, right? And same thing with freeze. You may feel quite numb, right? Or dissociated, where you really feel like floaty and you can't even really have a sense of that experience of feeling that you're in your body. And so when we do this work, we increase people's capacity to experience sensation in their body. And that's really what embodiment is full sensation of what you're experiencing in your body, right? And it's kind of you can kind of just dance around what that's like as far as, you know, explaining it, but you feel the weight in your legs. You feel your shoulders relaxed, right? There's a sense of comfort and ease with your body and the way it exists in a room or walking around outside, right? And I know when I was doing this work as a client, which I continuously do, but at the beginning, after I did a few big pieces of work, I remember the next morning waking up and petting my cat and just thinking, oh my gosh, I never realized how soft she is, right? So there's this sense of coming back into my body, of being able to feel more with my body, in it, with it, right? Increased capacity to even just notice the sunshine on my face and feel the warmth and let that in and let that feel good, right? When we have trauma and we're living with complex PTSD or PTSD, we are wound up in a way where life is not comfortable, right? We can be in the most beautiful places. We can go on amazing vacations and we're wound up, right? Or we're shut down and overwhelmed. Okay. And that creates quite uncomfortable states. And a lot of us live that way our whole lives and don't even realize what it could be like to feel good, to feel embodied.
It's funny because I again, from my health coach practice, I say some people have no idea how good their bodies are designed to feel. And I say that within the context of emotions and physical health and mental health and spiritual health. But really, it's from my health coaching practice of like feeling light and having vitality and good rest and no food coma after eating, the wrong foods and no inflammation in the gut, like just feeling great in your body. But I can relate to what you're saying because the body's meant to feel amazing. And it's hard to do that from, again, a health coaching perspective when we're eating horribly, not sleeping, but also from a somatic therapy perspective when we're so traumatized and don't feel well in the world. And I guess this brings me back to the question around trauma. I understand when there's complex trauma or like real serious, domestic abuse, sexual abuse, verbal or physical abuse, especially for children. But aside from those big, like capital T traumas, it sounds like we all have traumas because even if you had the most amazing parents in the house who had a beautiful marriage, you might have heard them fight. And as a child, hearing a mom or dad slam the door, it's scary, even though they made up the next day and they have this beautiful marriage. Or you got yelled at because your mom was so exhausted because something happened in her life. You got yelled at for getting a C in one of your math classes. And she didn't mean to yell at you, but you got yelled at and you're 6 years old and you're freaked out. Or you have this fight or flight response because life is sometimes scary. You're either doing a presentation and you fall and you embarrass yourself, or you had a close call on a highway where you really almost did have something happen, but it didn't happen. So you didn't experience a car wreck, but you almost did. So it scared you and it put you in this stress response and you are activated. So when I think about someone who's 20, 30, 40, 50 years old without those big complex traumas, they have a collection of decades worth of these little traumas. So are we all walking around with dysregulated nervous systems and with traumas in our body? Again, from a health coach perspective, I think the world that we live in is kind of dysregulated. It's not set up in a natural way with social media and technology and pollution and all this stuff to make us feel regulated and well. So we have to make an effort to choose, activities and behaviors and habits that help us. But aside from that, would you say we're just all walking around with traumatized bodies?
Yes, I would.
And short answer is yes. And we all have to do the work.
Yeah, we all do. This isn't just for people who have severe mental illness or, really severe chronic health issues. Of course, those things often can, this is very useful to supporting those people as well. But I don't know anyone who doesn't have some wounding, right? And what you're saying is this world really isn't it's not built for human bodies. It's built to create wounded instincts, unfortunately. And so that's a huge issue. And so we have to really consciously create lives that support our nervous systems. And also, I'll say life is traumatic. That's the thing. People come in my office and we do this work and it's great. And they go back out and someone in their life dies or, something else traumatic happens. And so this work isn't about healing. It's not where you get to some point where you're healed. It's about building, it's about, releasing that and healing past traumas and building resiliency so that future traumas don't take us down so much. Right? And when we build that resiliency and that capacity, we can have, a scary moment on the highway, and then we could pull over. Maybe we want to put a hand on the head, hand on the belly, take a few breaths, let the body feel the shaking, let that move through, and we can really let ourselves come back. But what we need to start doing is actually attuning instead of bypassing. And when we already have trauma, the way that we navigate that experience of being traumatized is we don't attune, right? There's that split. It reinforces that split between the mind and the body. And so we do this work and then we also shift the way we relate to our body. Maybe we go on more walks in nature. What builds your resiliency? That's going to be an individual question for each person, right? And that's how you start to really consciously create a life that supports the body and supports healing wounded instincts or keeping them from getting wounded, right? And we're just shifting into that as far as, you know, kind of on more of a collective level of like, wow, maybe we should pay attention to our physiology as well and how that affects our mental health.
100%. I couldn't agree with what you said more. And I think I fundamentally do agree with you that we are all traumatized in some way and that life is traumatizing, especially this 21st century life. And just the way I encourage clients to have a professional in their corner to help them with their mental health or with building healthy habits, whether, again, it's a coach or it's a therapist or whatever. It's also important to have a physiotherapist and a physical therapist and someone that's just helping us. We can't do this life alone. We need support. And I feel like, you know, just the way we build ourselves and build resilience in our physical body at the gym, it's also important to take care of our emotional, spiritual, and mental well-being. And so, yes, life is hard and we need to help discharge some of these difficult emotions that I know also get stuck in the body. You said attunement, which I'm guessing means allowing for that event to really be kind of digested, processed, and maybe not integrated, but released from the body instead of that, what you call a disconnect, which is just getting on with the day, right? You're saying like, let's attune to the body and really allow this event to come through. Can you explain what that could look like? And could you maybe give us some tips that we can do in our daily life with the tools we have around us in our homes?
Yeah, so it's important. You know, they say actually people with complex PTSD or PTSD, meditating isn't a great start. People often try to jump into things like that. And what it does is it can take us too deep inward. Okay. And that kind of trauma vortex from what we've experienced can pull us in and kind of take over. Right. So it's a really delicate balance of attuning to what we're feeling, but then actually attuning to the safety of our environment, maybe where we actually do feel comfort in our body. Maybe we feel a really big knot in the stomach. Okay, so we notice that knot. We give our awareness a moment to really be with it. And then we ask ourselves, where do I feel most comfortable in my body? And if you notice the whole body is like lit up with uncomfortable feelings, it could be the pinky toes or the earlobes, right? And we just go to where is there either comfortable or neutral. And so then we bring the awareness to that area. And what we do is we create enough safety for the stomach to start to be able to unwind, right? When we bring our awareness to safety, the body says, oh, it might actually be safe here. I might actually be okay. The threat may be gone, right? And so then that digestion or integration release gets to happen. But we want to do that slowly. So we go into the trauma a little bit. So go into the awareness of the tightness in the stomach. And then bringing the awareness to the earlobes. Going back to the stomach and noticing what's different. Maybe it started to unwind a little bit. Maybe it's gotten a little more intense because it may need to build intensity before it can fully release. Right? But we just keep going back and forth. Or maybe instead of the earlobes, we look around and we see a beautiful tree in front of us or out the window. And we just let our eyes really get drawn into the way the wind is moving the leaves. Okay? And that gives the system that break. It opens a door for that traumatic stress to release that is showing up through the sensation of the tightness in the stomach. Okay? So that's a really good kind of basic activity or exercise that people can do at home. Also, something called orienting is great. So, I don't know, depending on where you've lived or where you've been, if you've ever seen a bunch of like deer out in a field grazing, right? What happens is they're often in a group. They put their head down, they take a bite of grass, and then as they chew, they bring their head up and they just slowly look from left to right. And they scan their environment. And so what they're doing is they're not scanning for danger necessarily. They're actually scanning for safety. Okay. And it keeps our systems regulated. And as humans, we're actually meant to be doing that. We're meant to really, every time we sit down in a room, look around and orient. We're meant to move through the world much slower than we do. Okay. As far as our instincts are concerned in our bodies. And so when we allow ourselves to really orient to a space, our systems are going to start to regulate more. We're going to start to come down from any sort of activation that's been triggered, just that's like consistently triggered or that has gotten recently triggered, right? Because it's like how I explained before, our bodies are like a time machine, right? Instead, we're really landing in the moment. And you might just call that mindfulness, but what we're doing is we're landing into safety and giving the system some safety so that it can actually start to digest and feel some relief. Another good one is the VOO sound. So it's VOOO. And if you've ever been to like a yoga class where people, go, it's similar to that, but you're making the VOO sound. So typically you'll do it in rounds of 3, similar to the Om, right? But what we're doing is making the VOO sound actually vibrates the vagus nerve, which is on that sheet that I was pointing at earlier, what allows us to be in that lower area of regulation. That's the rest and digest part of this parasympathetic nervous system. So we don't have to learn all those terms, but when we do the VOO sound, it vibrates the vagus nerve, which really allows that our systems to come into that rest and digest state. And so even if you're at work having a hard time, feeling really anxious, go to the bathroom, do a few rounds of VOOing, notice how you feel, do some orienting. Those are all great things that you can do consistently and make a really big difference. But I would also say, like you said before, we really do need support of others. I don't know who said this, but I really love it. And it's, if we get hurt in relationship, we need to heal in relationship, right? And so that's what I'm providing as a practitioner, is relationship as well, and support through relationship, because a lot of our traumas come from experiences with other people. And a lot of people with trauma can be high functioning and can really want to do everything on their own. So starting to let someone in to just be a support, that it can be scary, but it's a big part of the work as well.
I've read somewhere that we hold things in because we were never given a safe space to let it out. So that's kind of in relation to what you're saying, that, and what I've said before as well, that we need community, we need each other, we need support, we need a safe space. It's really helpful in a healing journey. And it's so funny that you talk about VOOing. I've never heard that before. I am a yoga teacher, like certified yoga teacher. And so something I share with my clients, of course, about the vagus nerve, which builds future resilience. So we want a good vagal tone because it helps us deal with future stress. It's also very important for your overall health. But I say to my client, just exhale with sound. And do that long vibration because it stimulates the vagus nerve. So it's really funny that you bring up VOOing, and I relate to it with umming, and I explain to them how umming will also vibrate the vagus nerve. So that's really, I guess, validating that that's something that is important for somatic release and is something you use in your practice. When you talked about the gazelle kind of orienting and searching its horizon for safety, I read that EMDR therapy, and I can't remember what that acronym stands for. Do you remember what it stands for? Eye movement, desensitization, release, maybe? I don't know. We might want to look that up before we say it again. But yeah. Yeah, so just for people who don't know, EMDR is basically using eye movement to access some of the deep patterns of the nervous system and to access deeper memories and to help reprogram the nervous system and the subconscious mind. And the way that this works is because when you're moving your eyes left to right in the presence of a practitioner, obviously, you're actually helping the left and the right hemispheres of the brain kind of speak to each other and connect, as well as the left and right sides of the body. And apparently this therapy modality was created or was influenced or inspired by humans walking, because when we walk, we naturally scan our environments. We look far and near and left and right and up and down and all over the place. And that is actually really, it's a very, I don't want to just say it's a healing modality because it's very healing, but it's just a natural, instinctive way to be. But because of our sedentary office lifestyle, we're, either in front of the laptop 9 to 5, in front of our phones, in front of the TV, that we're not allowing our eyes to really scan the environment. And there's a lot of studies out there that say when we scan far into the horizon, you actually can regulate the amygdala or calm down the amygdala, which is the part of the brain that assesses threat and is also the emotional regulator. So it's really interesting how you talk about the gazelle searching its horizon, because as humans, we should be naturally doing that as well. And that's why walking is not just good for the body, but it's good for the mind. Some of my favorite practices is dancing, shaking, exercise, obviously walking. And I love some kind of powerful breath work. Like, I don't know if you know breath of joy. It's kind of done in yoga classes where it's very like powerful inhales and very loud exhales. And it's very releasing to me. And it's very powerful in the sense that after 10 rounds, the whole body's energy changes. Do you feel like these kind of more physical manifestations or physical exercises are helpful to discharge energy in the body? Not about like a recent event that happened, like I just got into a close call on the highway, but kind of like as practices to do day to day to just help the body regulate and discharge things that have happened last week, last month, 2 years ago, just as like a management tool or part of your lifestyle?
Yes. I would say exercise is a huge support for healing, because really, especially when we're in that fight or flight state, right? So if we're really struggling with freeze and shutdown, we don't want to go do something really intense. Okay. We don't want to go on a run. We want to help our bodies slowly come back and thaw out, right, from that freeze state. So maybe we want to drink a warm glass of tea, take a bath, do things that help us bring us back into the safety of the now if we're in that freeze response, shutdown, helplessness state. Okay? But if we are in that fight or flight, or we're in regulation, right, and we're feeling pretty regulated, exercise is amazing. And it's a great support to really feel our agency, right? When we run, if we're boxing, if we're lifting weights, you're feeling your strengths, right? And you're like, I can handle life, okay? So I would say it's not a go-to when you're really in shutdown to try to force yourself, because you're in a deeply contracted state. You don't want to open up too much. But when we're in that fight or flight or just moving our day-to-day life, that's an amazing tool to have continued resiliency and regulation. I would say people may take some of the exercises a little too far. And often when we have trauma, we can take things too far. Even healing, we can take too far. People see like a practitioner every day or something. And sometimes people may need that, but other times they're digging and they're waking up too much at once. And they don't have capacity to really digest it, right? So you don't want to wake up more than you can digest in a moment. And so I would just say each person should attune to that when they're doing exercises that may wake up more. Okay. We want to just really support in healing trauma. We want to support the system's ability to digest, waking it up, clearing it, purging it. Those are all things that can actually be re-traumatizing if they're done too much. But it really depends on how you feel. It's like if you have a breathwork practice that you do every day and it really helps and you notice increased, clarity and feeling better, do that, right? If you do a certain exercise and you get flooded with emotion and cry for 2 days, you probably just triggered your trauma and you want to slow down. So I would just say it really depends person to person on what's going on with them and what's supportive for them. Healing isn't an extreme, right? It's about finding that centered place. So adding things in at a pace that really works and where you can really track it instead of just going full force.
So I guess the main takeaway here is to be gentle with our bodies. I'd like to ask you one last question before we close. I am very aware as to how mental and emotional health can impact physical health and how traumas can impact physical health, ailments, serious diseases. And so I'd love to just ask you your experience with clients who have autoimmune diseases and chronic illnesses and how you've seen correlation or causation between their emotional traumas and these serious ailments that show up in their body.
Yeah, that's a great question. So when someone experiences trauma and it doesn't get released from their nervous system and they're living in chronic fight, flight, or freeze, their immune systems are going to not be able to function at an optimal level. Because if our adrenals are constantly being overworked because we feel like we're about to get eaten by a tiger physiologically, our bodies aren't able to regulate hormones, immune system, right? Those get quite not only neglected, but affected in really specific ways. And so when you see people with autoimmune conditions, one cause that we're really, learning more about in the world of somatics is the immune system. If the nervous system feels that there's a threat, the immune system feels something's attacking it. And so if the nervous system feels like we're getting attacked by a tiger, right? That's where the body goes. The immune system is going to go, we're getting attacked by a disease, right? We're getting attacked by a virus or bacteria. There's an invader, right? That's how it understands chronic fight flight in the nervous system. And so it fights back, right? And when it fights back, that creates an autoimmune condition. And an autoimmune condition is when the immune system is attacking something that isn't there and just attacks itself, right? And there's many different ways that shows up. And often, and this was the case for me, I dealt with chronic illness for years. When you start to do trauma work, your system starts to have more capacity to self-heal, right? Because all that energy isn't going toward the stress response. You don't have cortisol constantly running through your body. And the immune system gets to say, oh, wait, I am actually safe when I realize I'm in this room and I'm not back in that event that happened. And so the body is able to self-heal. And, a main thing that I see a lot of in clients is that their mindsets are that mind over body when they're trying to heal. And that's one of the biggest, right? We do the SE work and then we work more cognitively with you are trying to dominate and control your illness and your body. And that is not how relating with it. We have to shift the way of you're relating to your body in order for it to be able to self-heal. We have to support its ability to self-heal and its ability to feel safe, because chronic illness can become a trauma in itself, right? Living with debilitating and painful symptoms. And so it can, even further push us away from that attunement. So you really see how things progress over time with trauma that's not addressed. But it's never too late to work with it and support healing.
I guess that's a really nice way to close and a really nice tip, that it's never too late, no matter how old you are, how young you are. It's never too late to work on your health in any capacity. Where can people find you? I'll link everything below.
Yeah, so my website is really the main place to find me. It's resolvingtrauma.org. And I have an Instagram with one post, so we can leave that out. But that's the main place that you could find me, and there's all my contact info on there.
Okay, great. Well, Cheyenne, thank you for being here. This was such an incredible conversation. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and your experience with us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. This was really fun to do and to also get to hear a little bit more about your work and the way that you're supporting people and supporting them in their attunement to their bodies as well.
Yes, thank you for saying that. Bye.
All right, bye.
Thank you for listening. Please share with family and friends that you feel could benefit from this episode, and make sure to hit that subscribe button and leave a rating and review to support the show. Check out the links below for more information about my guests and where to find them, and make sure you're following me on Instagram at wholesome_practice to learn more about what I do. I appreciate you being here, and I'll see you on the next one. This podcast is for educational purposes only and should never replace the advice of your doctor or physician. Always consult a medical professional before making any changes or adding anything new to your diet, lifestyle, or medication protocol.